At my granddaughter's wedding, I realized I wasn't a guest. I was the joke everyone had already agreed on. I noticed it before anyone said a word, before the music swelled or the champagne glasses clinked. In something so small, it could have been dismissed as a mistake if I had wanted to keep lying to myself. The name tag was waiting for me at the check-in table, written in elegant gold script on a thick ivory card, the kind you only see at expensive events. I picked it up with steady fingers, expecting to see Margaret Collins, grandmother of the bride. Instead, I read the words twice, just to be certain my eyes hadn't betrayed me. The old lady who's paying for everything. For a moment, the room around me seemed to dim, as if someone had lowered the lights without warning. I could hear laughter somewhere behind me, the soft murmur of guests arriving, the distant sound of a violin tuning up near the ceremony hall, but it all felt far away, like I was standing behind glass watching someone else's life unfold. I didn't react. I didn't gasp or frown or march back to the young woman at the table to demand an explanation. I simply adjusted the edge of the card between my fingers, pinned it neatly to the left side of my pale blue dress, and smiled the way I had learned to smile over the years. Small, controlled, unreadable. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" the girl behind the table asked, her voice polite but cautious. I nodded once. "It's perfect," I said, and walked into the ballroom. The venue was everything my granddaughter Emily had dreamed of. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling that must have been at least 30 feet high, catching the light and scattering it across the polished marble floors. Round tables were draped in white linen, each centerpiece arranged with fresh peonies and roses flown in from somewhere I hadn't bothered to ask about because I already knew who had paid for them. The air smelled faintly of perfume and something sweet, maybe vanilla or champagne, and guests moved through the space in tailored suits and flowing dresses, their voices blending into a pleasant hum. It was beautiful. It was exactly the kind of wedding I had promised Emily she could have when she was a little girl sitting on my lap, flipping through bridal magazines and pointing at pictures she loved. I paused just inside the entrance, taking it all in, letting my eyes move slowly from one detail to the next. Nothing about this place looked accidental. Nothing about it looked like a joke. And yet, somehow, that small card pinned to my chest felt heavier than anything else in the room. I caught a glimpse of myself in one of the mirrored columns lining the wall. For a second, I saw what everyone else would see, a woman in her late 60s, silver hair styled carefully, posture straight, expression calm. Then my gaze dropped slightly, just enough to read the words resting over my heart. "The old lady who's paying for everything." I smoothed the fabric of my dress as if that might erase the sentence, but of course, it didn't. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and I took one without thinking, the cold glass steady in my hand. I didn't drink it. I just held it there, letting the chill ground me in the present moment. Across the room, I spotted my son, Daniel, standing near the bar, laughing with a group of guests. His posture was relaxed, confident. The way it had become over the years as success settled comfortably on his shoulders. Beside him stood his wife, Rebecca, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile bright and practiced as she greeted people I didn't recognize. She looked radiant, as always. Put together. In control. If she noticed me standing there, she didn't show it. I watched them for a moment longer than I should have, searching for something. An explanation, a hint of awareness, even a flicker of discomfort. But there was nothing. Just laughter. Just ease. Just the quiet certainty that everything was exactly as they intended it to be. I lifted my chin slightly and began to walk further into the room, each step measured, deliberate. No one stopped me. No one questioned the words on my chest. A few people glanced at the name tag, their expressions shifting just enough to tell me they had read it, but not enough to make a scene. Some looked away quickly. Others smiled a little too tightly, as if they weren't sure whether they were supposed to find it amusing. I returned every glance with the same calm expression, the same polite nod, as though nothing about this evening was out of the ordinary. Because in that moment, I understood something with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misplaced card or an unfortunate joke that had slipped through unnoticed. It was deliberate, thought out, approved. And the most remarkable part wasn't the insult itself. It was how easily everyone around me accepted it. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder and took another step forward, deeper into the celebration that had already decided what role I was meant to play. I didn't argue. I didn't remove the tag. I didn't leave. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, right in the center of it all, wearing their words like a quiet truth I had finally chosen to see. Because if this was the story they wanted to tell about me, then I needed to understand just how far they were willing to go to tell it. The music began just as I reached the center of the ballroom, a soft string melody that seemed to wrap around the room like silk, filling every empty space with something warm and celebratory, something that did not quite belong to me. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if I had all the time in the world, though I could feel the weight of curious glances brushing against me from every direction. It was not obvious at first. No one pointed. No one whispered loudly enough to be called out. But I noticed the subtle shifts, the way conversations paused for half a second longer than they should have when I passed by, the way eyes flickered down toward the card on my chest, and then quickly back up again, as if people were not quite sure whether they had read it correctly. I stopped near one of the tall cocktail tables and set my untouched glass of champagne down, aligning it carefully with the edge as though precision mattered in a moment like this. Two women stood nearby, both dressed in elegant navy dresses, their voices low but not low enough. "Did you see that?" one of them murmured, her tone carrying a hint of disbelief. "I thought it was a joke at first," the other replied softly. "But Rebecca said it herself. She told the planner to make sure everyone knew who made all of this possible." There was a pause, the kind that hangs in the air just long enough to say everything that words do not. "Still," the first woman added, "that is a strange way to put it." I did not turn toward them. I did not acknowledge that I had heard a single word. Instead, I adjusted the bracelet on my wrist, the one my husband had given me on our 40th anniversary, and let their voices fade into the background as though they were nothing more than part of the music. Across the room, the wedding planner moved with practiced efficiency, checking details, guiding servers, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Rebecca stood beside her now, gesturing toward the head table, her posture confident, her expression composed. She leaned in slightly, saying something that made the planner nod quickly, almost eagerly, before hurrying off to make an adjustment. I watched the exchange for a moment, noting how naturally Rebecca occupied that role, how seamlessly she directed the flow of the evening. It was not the first time I had seen her like this. She had always preferred control, always found a way to position herself at the center of every important moment. I remembered when Daniel bought their first house, how she had taken over the renovation plans, the budgeting, the final decisions, even though it was my check that had made the down payment possible. At the time, I told myself it was normal. Young couples needed to feel ownership, needed to build something that felt like theirs. I told myself many things back then. A server approached me with a polite smile, offering a small tray of appetizers. "Would you like one?" he asked. I glanced down at the delicate arrangement of bite-sized portions, each one crafted to look almost too perfect to eat. "No, thank you," I said gently, my voice steady, my expression unchanged. He nodded and moved on, leaving me once again alone with the quiet awareness of the room around me. The music shifted slightly, signaling that the ceremony would begin soon. Guests started to move toward their seats, guided by subtle cues from the staff. I followed at a measured pace, allowing others to pass me, observing the way they carried themselves, the ease in their steps, the absence of any weight pressing against them. When I reached my table, I paused for a brief moment, looking down at the place card set neatly on the linen. It bore the same message as the one pinned to my dress, written in the same careful script, as if consistency had been important to whoever designed it. I pulled out the chair slowly and sat down, smoothing my dress beneath me, placing my hands lightly in my lap. To my left, a man I did not recognize offered a polite nod. "Beautiful wedding," he said, his tone friendly but measured. "It is," I replied, meeting his eyes for just a second before letting my gaze drift forward again. On the stage, the officiant took his place, and the room gradually quieted, anticipation settling over the guests like a soft blanket. I could feel it, that shared sense of expectation, of joy, of something beginning. And yet, sitting there with those words resting against me, I felt something else entirely. Not shock, not even embarrassment. Those had already passed. What remained was something cooler, something sharper. Understanding. Because as I watched my family move through this carefully constructed celebration, as I listened to the music swell and the conversations fade into respectful silence, I realized that this evening was not just about a wedding. It was about roles, about narratives, about who was allowed to be seen and how. And mine had already been decided long before I walked through those doors. I sat there, perfectly still, my expression calm, my posture composed, and I let the realization settle into place with a quiet certainty. They were comfortable, confident, certain that I would accept this, just as I had accepted so many things before. And perhaps, until this moment, they had been right to believe that. I folded my hands together more tightly, just enough to feel the pressure, just enough to remind myself that I was still here, still present, still capable of seeing clearly. Because once you truly see something, once you understand it, without excuses or illusions, you cannot unsee it. And I had no intention of looking away again. The ceremony unfolded with quiet precision, each moment falling into place exactly as it had been rehearsed, as if nothing in this room had ever been left to chance. I watched Emily walk down the aisle, her arm linked with Daniel's, her expression soft and radiant in a way that reminded me of when she was a little girl running through my kitchen in mismatched socks, asking me to braid her hair. For a brief moment, something warm stirred inside me, something familiar and fragile, but it did not last. It could not survive in a room where every detail had been so carefully curated, including the version of me that everyone seemed comfortable accepting. I kept my gaze steady, my posture straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap as the officiant spoke about love and family and lifelong commitment. Words that once meant something to me. Words that now felt like polished glass, beautiful on the surface but hollow when you tapped against them. When the ceremony ended, the room filled with applause, a wave of sound that carried everyone to their feet. I stood as well, clapping softly, my expression unchanged, my movements measured. Guests began to shift again, guided toward the reception area where the evening would continue with dinner and speeches. I moved with them, not leading, not following, simply existing within the flow, observing everything with a clarity that felt almost detached. By the time everyone was seated again, the energy in the room had changed. It was lighter now, more relaxed, conversations overlapping, laughter rising and falling like a gentle tide. Plates were served, glasses refilled, and the low hum of celebration settled comfortably over the tables. I sat quietly, listening without appearing to listen, noticing the way my name surfaced in conversation without ever being spoken directly to me. "It must have cost a fortune," someone at the next table remarked. "Well, you know who covered it," another voice replied, followed by a soft chuckle. I kept my eyes on the table in front of me, tracing the pattern of the linen with my gaze as if it required my full attention. The first speech began shortly after dinner was served. Daniel stood up, tapping his glass lightly to draw the room's attention. The sound cut through the noise, sharp and deliberate, and gradually, the conversations quieted. He smiled, looking around the room with an ease that suggested he had practiced this moment, perhaps more than once. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice warm, confident. He spoke about Emily, about how proud he was, about watching her grow into the woman she had become. His words were appropriate, well chosen, exactly what everyone expected to hear. Then, almost seamlessly, his tone shifted. "And of course," he continued, glancing briefly in my direction, though not quite meeting my eyes, "none of this would have been possible without a very special person in our family." There was a pause, just long enough to draw attention, just long enough to prepare the room for what came next. "We are all incredibly grateful for the support that made tonight happen." A few heads turned toward me then, subtle but unmistakable, their expressions polite, curious, some even appreciative. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the attention without inviting it, maintaining the same calm composure I had held all evening. It was not what he said that mattered. It was what he did not say. No name. No acknowledgement of who I was beyond the role they had assigned to me. Support. A resource. A quiet presence behind the scenes. The room responded with a gentle murmur of agreement, a few scattered claps, as if that brief mention had been sufficient, as if it had completed the picture they all seemed comfortable with. Rebecca stood next, her glass raised, her smile bright and effortless. "We wanted this day to be perfect," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "And thanks to certain generous contributions, we were able to make that happen." She laughed lightly, a sound that invited others to join in, and many did. It was not cruel laughter. It was not loud or pointed. It was something softer, something easier to accept. And perhaps that made it worse. I felt the corners of my lips lift into a small, controlled smile, the same one I had worn since I walked through the doors. I even raised my glass slightly in response, as if I were part of the joke, as if I had agreed to the role they had written for me. Inside, something shifted again, settling into place with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. This was not a single moment. It was not an isolated decision or a thoughtless mistake. It was a pattern, reinforced and repeated until it became the truth everyone accepted without question. I set my glass back down carefully, aligning it once more with the edge of the table, my movements precise, deliberate. Around me, the celebration continued, uninterrupted, seamless, as though nothing unusual had occurred. But I no longer needed confirmation. I no longer needed to question what I was seeing. The clarity was complete now, sharp and undeniable. And as I sat there, surrounded by people who believed they understood exactly who I was, I realized that for the first time in a very long time, I understood them just as clearly. The applause faded gradually, dissolving into a softer rhythm of conversation and clinking glasses, as though the room itself had exhaled after holding its breath for just a moment too long. I remained seated, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, my fingers still, my expression composed. Around me, people leaned closer to one another, their voices low but animated, their attention shifting away from the speeches and back to the comfort of familiar exchanges. It was in these quieter moments that the truth often revealed itself most clearly, not in grand gestures or deliberate words, but in the small, unguarded details people forgot to hide. To my right, a couple I vaguely recognized from previous gatherings spoke in hushed tones, their heads tilted toward each other in quiet conspiracy. "I mean, it is generous," the woman said, her voice careful, as though she were choosing each word with precision. "But to make it so obvious like that," the man beside her gave a small shrug. "Some people like the attention," he replied. "Maybe she wanted it that way." I allowed the corners of my lips to lift slightly, not enough to be noticed, just enough to acknowledge the irony of it. Wanted. As if any part of this had been my decision. I reached for my glass again, finally taking a small sip, the taste of champagne light and crisp, almost too delicate to leave any real impression. Across the room, Rebecca moved effortlessly from table to table, her presence polished, her voice warm as she thanked guests for attending, for celebrating, for being part of this carefully orchestrated evening. She paused occasionally, leaning in just enough to make each person feel seen, important, included. It was a skill she had perfected over time, the ability to create connection without offering anything real. I had admired it once. I understood it differently now. Daniel joined her after a moment, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back as they spoke to a group near the dance floor. They looked like a picture of success, of unity, of something solid and enviable. If anyone had asked, I would have said the same thing. For years, I had said the same thing. The band began to play again, a slower melody this time, something meant to draw couples toward the dance floor. A few guests rose from their seats, laughing softly as they moved together, their steps unpracticed but easy. I watched them for a moment, the way they leaned into one another, the way their movements seemed to belong to a different kind of evening, one untouched by the quiet undercurrents that ran beneath the surface here. My gaze drifted back to the head table, where Emily sat beside her new husband, her attention captured by something he was saying. She smiled, her expression open, unguarded, untouched by any of the tension that had settled so firmly within me. I wondered, briefly, how much she knew, how much she had seen, or if she, too, had accepted the version of me that had been presented to her, polished and simplified until it fit neatly into the narrative everyone preferred. I did not let the thought linger. Instead, I shifted my attention to something else, something smaller, something easier to hold. The place card in front of me. The ink had not smudged. The lettering remained precise, deliberate, as if whoever had written it had taken care to ensure it would be read clearly, without confusion, without room for interpretation. I traced the edge of the card lightly with my fingertip, not enough to move it, just enough to feel its presence. Solid, intentional, real. A memory surfaced then, uninvited but persistent. A different table, a different event. Years ago, when Daniel had first introduced Rebecca to the family. She had been charming that evening, attentive, quick to laugh, quick to compliment. I remembered how she had asked about my work, my interests, my life, as though she genuinely wanted to know. Family is everything to me, she had said back then, her eyes bright, her voice sincere. I had believed her. I had welcomed her without hesitation, without caution, trusting that the warmth she offered was something genuine, something lasting. I thought about that version of her now, the one I had chosen to see, and compared it to the woman moving gracefully through this room, directing, shaping, defining. The difference was not as large as I might have once believed. It was simply clearer now, more complete. The music swelled slightly, and a few more guests joined the dance floor, their movements filling the space with a kind of gentle energy that contrasted sharply with the stillness I maintained. I did not feel the need to move. I did not feel the need to speak. Everything I needed to understand was already unfolding around me, piece by piece, detail by detail, until there was no longer any room for doubt. I adjusted the napkin in my lap, smoothing it carefully, my movements slow, deliberate, controlled. There was a kind of comfort in that control, in the ability to choose each action with intention, to remain steady while everything else shifted. Because that was what this was, I realized. Not chaos, not cruelty in its loudest form, but something quieter, something more refined. A careful arrangement of moments designed to place me exactly where they believed I belonged. And the most remarkable part was how easily it had been done. How naturally I had stepped into that place without question, without resistance, until now. I lifted my gaze once more, scanning the room with the same calm attention I had carried all evening. Nothing had changed on the surface. The laughter, the music, the movement, all of it continued as if untouched. But beneath it, something had shifted, something subtle but irreversible. And as I sat there, perfectly still, surrounded by a celebration that no longer felt like mine, I understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by their expectations, but by something far more deliberate, something they had not yet considered. The evening continued to unfold with a kind of effortless rhythm, each moment flowing into the next, as if nothing beneath the surface had shifted at all. The band transitioned into a livelier tune, and more guests found their way to the dance floor, their laughter rising above the music in soft bursts of joy. I remained seated for a while longer, observing, letting the patterns around me settle into something I could recognize, something I could understand without needing to question it further. There was a comfort in that clarity, even if it came wrapped in something far less gentle than I would have once hoped for. A server approached again, this time placing a fresh glass of water in front of me without a word. I nodded in quiet acknowledgement, my fingers brushing lightly against the cool surface of the glass. Small gestures, polite exchanges, everything maintained at a level that felt appropriate, controlled, contained. It was remarkable how easily a room full of people could sustain that balance, how naturally everyone moved within the boundaries that had been set without ever needing to discuss them aloud. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood, smoothing the front of my dress with a careful motion that felt almost automatic. The fabric fell perfectly into place, just as it had when I first arrived, untouched by the weight of the evening, untouched by anything at all. I stepped away from the table, not toward the dance floor, not toward the center of attention, but toward the edges of the room where the lighting softened and the noise dimmed slightly. It was easier to think there, easier to see without distraction. As I moved, I passed by a series of framed photographs displayed along a long table near the wall. Moments from Emily's life, carefully selected and arranged in chronological order. There she was as a child, smiling brightly with missing teeth, holding a small birthday cake I remembered baking for her in my kitchen. There she was again a few years later, standing proudly in a graduation gown, her arm wrapped around Daniel's shoulders. And then more recent images, vacations, celebrations, milestones I had only partially been a part of, or sometimes not at all. I paused in front of one photograph in particular. It showed Emily and Rebecca together, standing in what looked like the very same ballroom, likely during a planning visit. Rebecca's hand rested lightly on Emily's shoulder, guiding her gaze towards something just outside the frame, something I could not see. I studied that image for a moment longer than necessary, taking in the composition, the positioning, the subtle message it conveyed without ever needing to say it directly. Guidance, direction, control. A quiet memory surfaced again, this time sharper, more defined. I saw myself sitting at my kitchen table 2 years earlier, a stack of papers spread out in front of me, budgets and estimates for this very wedding. Emily had sat across from me, her eyes bright with excitement, her voice filled with plans and possibilities. "I want it to be something everyone remembers," she had said, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. I had smiled then, reaching across the table to rest my hand over hers. "It will be," I told her. "We will make sure of that." And we did. Every detail, every choice, every expense. I had signed the checks without hesitation, without condition, trusting that what I was giving was more than money, that it was a way of supporting something meaningful, something rooted in love and family and shared joy. Standing there now, looking at the carefully curated version of that journey displayed in polished frames, I realized how little of that truth had remained intact. The narrative had shifted somewhere along the way, adjusted, refined, until it no longer required my presence in the way I had once imagined. I continued along the table, my steps unhurried, my gaze steady. Guests passed behind me, their voices blending into a soft backdrop of conversation, but none of it felt directed at me anymore. It was as if I had moved just slightly outside the center of their awareness, present but not essential, visible but not fully acknowledged. And perhaps that was exactly where they preferred me to be. I reached the end of the display and turned slightly, allowing my eyes to sweep across the room once more. Daniel and Rebecca stood near the dance floor now, speaking with a group of guests, their expressions relaxed, their movements easy. Emily laughed at something her husband said, her head tilting back slightly, her joy unguarded and sincere. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as it had been designed to look. I placed my hand lightly against the edge of the table beside me, grounding myself in the solid surface, the quiet certainty of something that did not shift or change depending on who was watching. Because beneath the elegance, beneath the music and the laughter and the carefully chosen words, there was something else now, something that had settled into place with a kind of quiet finality. Understanding, yes, but also recognition, not just of what they had done, but of what I had allowed, of the moments I had overlooked, the assumptions I had accepted, the role I had stepped into without question because it felt easier than examining it too closely. I drew in a slow breath, steady and controlled, and let it out just as carefully. There was no urgency in me, no impulse to react or confront or disrupt the evening that continued so smoothly around me. That was not where my strength lay. It never had been. Instead, I allowed that understanding to deepen, to settle, to take shape in a way that felt deliberate and complete. Because once something becomes clear, truly clear, it no longer needs to be rushed. It simply waits, patient and certain, for the right moment to be seen by others the same way it has been seen by you. And as I stood there, just beyond the center of it all, I knew with quiet certainty that that moment would come, not because I forced it, but because I would choose it. The music softened again as the evening moved into its next phase. The kind of transition that most people barely noticed, but that subtly shifted the atmosphere from celebration to reflection. I remained near the edge of the room, my hand still resting lightly against the table, when I noticed a familiar figure standing a few feet away, just outside the flow of guests. He had not been there a moment ago, or perhaps he had, and I had only just allowed myself to see him. Either way, his presence felt different from the others, quieter, more deliberate. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying none of the performative warmth that filled the rest of the room. I turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "Mr. Reynolds," I replied, offering a small nod of recognition. He had been my husband's attorney for many years, a man who rarely attended events like this unless there was a reason beyond simple courtesy. He held a slim envelope in his hand, the kind that did not draw attention, the kind that could easily be overlooked by anyone not looking for it. "I was not sure if I would find you here," he continued, his tone measured. but I thought it would be best to speak with you in person. I studied him for a moment, noting the seriousness in his expression, the absence of small talk, of pleasantries. It usually is, I said quietly. He glanced briefly around the room, ensuring that no one was close enough to overhear, then extended the envelope toward me. I did not take it immediately. Instead, I let my gaze rest on it for a second longer than necessary, considering the weight of something so small, something that had arrived at a moment that felt anything but accidental. Your husband asked that this be delivered under very specific circumstances, he said, his voice lowering slightly. Circumstances that, unfortunately, appear to have been met. I felt a subtle shift within me, not surprise, not even curiosity, but recognition. My husband had always been precise, always attentive to details others might overlook. If he had arranged something like this, there would have been a reason. There was always a reason. I reached out then, taking the envelope from his hand with a steady motion. The paper was smooth beneath my fingers, the seal unbroken. Is there anything I should know before I read this? I asked, my tone even, controlled. Mr. Reynolds held my gaze for a moment, as though weighing his response carefully. Only that it reflects his wishes, he said, and that those wishes were very clear. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging his answer without pressing further. There was no need. Whatever was inside that envelope would speak for itself. I slipped it into my purse without opening it, my movements unhurried, deliberate. Mr. Reynolds watched me for a brief moment longer, then gave a small nod. I will be available if you have any questions, he added. Of course, I replied. He did not linger. Within seconds, he had stepped back into the crowd, his presence dissolving into the same quiet anonymity that had allowed him to approach me without notice. I remained where I was, my hand resting lightly against the side of my purse now, aware of the envelope inside, aware of the shift it represented without yet needing to confirm it. Around me, nothing had changed. The music continued. The guests laughed. The celebration moved forward exactly as it had been designed to. But beneath that surface, something had aligned, something that connected the past to the present in a way that felt both inevitable and precise. I allowed myself a slow breath, steady and controlled, letting the moment settle without rushing it. There was no urgency. There was no need to react immediately, to open the envelope in haste, or to seek out answers before I was ready to receive them. Timing mattered. It always had. I turned my gaze back toward the center of the room, where Daniel and Rebecca now stood beside Emily and her husband, preparing for the next sequence of events, perhaps the first dance or another round of speeches. Their expressions were relaxed, confident, untouched by any awareness of what had just passed quietly at the edge of their carefully constructed evening. I watched them for a moment, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a clarity that felt almost detached. They believed they understood the boundaries of this situation. They believed they had defined the narrative, assigned the roles, and secured the outcome. And for a long time, they had been right. I adjusted the strap of my purse slightly, ensuring that it rested comfortably against my shoulder, the envelope inside remaining exactly where I had placed it. I did not need to look at it again to know that it was there, that it carried something significant, something that would not be undone or dismissed once it was revealed. The music swelled once more, drawing attention back to the center of the room as the next part of the evening began. Guests turned their chairs, shifting their focus, their attention guided effortlessly by the rhythm of the event. I remained where I was for a moment longer, allowing myself to exist just outside that movement, just beyond the reach of their expectations. Because while they continued forward, confident in the story they had created, I now held something they had not accounted for. Something that had been set in motion long before tonight, waiting quietly, patiently, for the exact moment it would be needed. And as I finally stepped away from the edge and began to move back toward the center of the room, my expression calm, my posture steady, I understood with complete certainty that whatever came next would not belong to them. I stepped back into the center of the room just as the music shifted again, softer now, more deliberate, drawing every eye toward the dance floor where Emily and her husband took their positions. The lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow over the polished floor, and for a moment, everything felt almost suspended, as if the entire evening had been building toward this exact point. I took my seat once more, my posture unchanged, my expression composed, my purse resting neatly against the side of my chair, the envelope inside it quiet and unseen. Around me, guests leaned forward slightly, their attention focused, their faces softened by the intimacy of the moment. The first notes of the song began, slow and steady, and Emily stepped into her husband's arms with a kind of trust that was both beautiful and fragile. I watched them move. Together, their steps careful at first, then gradually more fluid as they found their rhythm. It was a moment meant to represent something lasting, something built on understanding and respect, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to see it that way, to appreciate the simplicity of it without letting the rest of the evening intrude. But clarity does not disappear once it arrives. It waits, just beneath the surface, shaping everything you see. I noticed the way Rebecca stood at the edge of the dance floor, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her smile perfectly measured as she watched the couple. Daniel stood beside her, his posture relaxed, his attention fixed on his daughter, pride evident in the slight lift of his chin. They looked like parents who had done everything right, who had guided their child to this moment with care and intention. And perhaps, in their own way, they believed that was true. I reached into my purse then, my movements slow, deliberate, as though I were simply adjusting something inside. My fingers found the envelope easily, its edges familiar now even without sight. I drew it out just enough to rest it lightly against my palm, still closed, still sealed, its presence steady and certain. I did not open it. Not yet. Instead, I let it remain there, a quiet weight in my hand, as I returned my gaze to the dance floor. The song continued, each note blending into the next, and the room seemed to breathe in unison, caught in the gentle rhythm of the moment. I could feel the shift within myself again, not abrupt, not overwhelming, but precise. A transition from observation to understanding, from understanding to intention. Everything I had seen, everything I had heard, had settled into place, forming something complete, something that no longer required explanation. I lowered the envelope back into my purse, closing it carefully, ensuring that nothing about my actions drew attention. There would be time for that later. Timing, I reminded myself again, was everything. The song came to an end, and the room responded with applause, warm and genuine, rising and falling in a wave that carried the couple back toward their seats. Emily laughed softly, her face glowing, her happiness untouched by anything beyond the moment she was living. I watched her for a second longer, allowing that image to settle, to remain separate from everything else I now understood. Because whatever came next, whatever choices I would make, they were not about her. They never had been. The applause faded, and the evening shifted once more, moving toward the next sequence, the next carefully planned moment. A voice over the microphone announced another round of dancing, inviting guests to join, to celebrate, to participate. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people stood, couples forming, conversations picking up again with renewed energy. I remained seated for a moment longer, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my breathing steady, my thoughts clear. Then, without hesitation, I stood. Not to join the dance, not to seek out anyone in particular, but simply to move. To choose my position within the room rather than accept the one that had been assigned to me. I walked slowly, my steps measured, weaving through the guests with quiet ease, my presence neither hidden nor announced. A few people glanced at me as I passed, their eyes flickering briefly to the card still pinned to my dress, then back to my face, as if searching for a reaction they could interpret, something that would confirm their understanding of who I was in this moment. I offered them nothing, no discomfort, no acknowledgement, only the same calm expression I had carried all evening. Because the truth was, their understanding no longer mattered. I reached the edge of the dance floor and paused, watching as the space filled with movement and laughter, the music rising again, bright and full. It was a beautiful scene, perfectly arranged, perfectly executed. And yet, standing there, I could see it for what it was beneath the surface. A performance, carefully constructed, carefully maintained. I adjusted the small card on my chest one final time, ensuring it sat exactly as it had been placed, the words clear, visible, undeniable. Not as a mark of shame, not as something to be hidden or corrected, but as something I had chosen to carry, at least for now. Because sometimes, The most effective way to reveal the truth is not to deny it, but to let it stand exactly as it is, until everyone else is forced to see it as clearly as you do. I lifted my chin slightly, my gaze steady, my posture firm, and allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to settle across my lips. Not for them, not for the room, but for the quiet certainty that had taken hold within me. They believed the story was already written. They believed the roles were fixed, the outcome decided. But stories have a way of shifting when the person at the center finally understands the script. And as I stood there, just at the edge of their celebration, I knew with complete clarity that I was no longer following the one they had given me. The music carried on, brighter now, louder, filling the room with a kind of energy that invited everyone to lose themselves in it, to forget anything that did not belong to the celebration. I remained where I was at the edge of the dance floor, watching as people moved more freely, their laughter less restrained, their gestures more open. Glasses were raised, conversations overlapped, and the evening seemed to settle into that familiar rhythm where everything felt effortless, unexamined, unquestioned. I took a slow step back, then another, allowing myself to drift away from the center once more, not out of discomfort, but out of intention. Distance, I had learned, often revealed more than proximity ever could. Near the back of the room, a smaller hallway branched off from the main ballroom, dimly lit, quieter, used mostly by staff moving between spaces. I stepped into it without hesitation, the sound of the music softening immediately behind me, replaced by a gentle stillness that felt almost deliberate. For the first time that evening, I allowed my shoulders to relax slightly, not in defeat, but in clarity. I reached into my purse again, my fingers finding the envelope with ease, and this time, I did not pause. I drew it out fully, turning it over in my hands, noting the familiar handwriting on the front, steady and precise, just as it had always been. My husband's handwriting. Even now, it carried a sense of order, of intention, of something that had been carefully considered long before this moment arrived. I broke the seal slowly, the sound soft but distinct in the quiet space around me. Inside, a single folded document rested, thick paper, official, unmistakable. I unfolded it carefully, my eyes moving across the lines with calm focus, taking in each word exactly as it was written, without rushing, without skipping ahead. The language was clear, direct. There was no room for interpretation. A clause, a condition, one that had been placed within the structure of his estate with deliberate precision. It outlined expectations, respect, conduct, and consequences. Not emotional consequences, not symbolic ones. Legal, binding, irreversible. I read it once. Then again, slower this time, allowing the full weight of it to settle into place. If I, as his surviving spouse, was publicly humiliated, disrespected, or reduced in standing within the family by those who stood to benefit from his estate, specific provisions would be triggered. Assets would be reassigned. Access revoked. Authority shifted. Not partially. Completely. I lowered the document slightly, my expression unchanged, my breathing steady. There was no surge of triumph, no immediate sense of vindication. Only a quiet, undeniable alignment between what I had seen and what had already been anticipated long before tonight. He had known. Not the details, perhaps, not the exact moment or the specific words that would be used, but the pattern, the possibility. The risk that something like this could happen once he was no longer there to stand between me and the subtle shifts of loyalty that often follow loss. I folded the document carefully, returning it to the envelope with the same precision I had used to remove it. My movements were slow, controlled, deliberate. There was no urgency. There was no need to act immediately, to confront, to reveal. That was not the nature of this kind of power. It did not demand attention. It did not require noise. It simply existed, waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. I slipped the envelope back into my purse, closing it securely, ensuring that nothing about its presence could be detected from the outside. Then I stood there for a moment longer, allowing the quiet of the hallway to settle around me, to ground me in something steady and certain before I stepped back into the world they had created. When I returned to the ballroom, nothing had changed. The music continued. The laughter remained. The dance floor was full, the energy high, the illusion intact. Daniel and Rebecca were still at the center of it all, moving effortlessly through conversations, their confidence untouched, their understanding of the evening unchanged. I watched them for a brief moment, not with resentment, not with anger, but with a clarity that felt almost distant. They believed they were in control. They believed the narrative had been secured, the roles defined, the outcome decided. And in a way, they were right. The narrative had been written, just not by them. I moved back toward my table, my steps unhurried, my posture steady, my expression calm. A few guests glanced at me as I passed, their eyes lingering for a fraction of a second longer than before, perhaps sensing something they could not quite name, something that did not fit neatly into the version of me they had already accepted. I gave them nothing to confirm or deny their impressions, only the same composed presence I had carried from the beginning. I reached my seat and sat down quietly, smoothing my dress once more, aligning the edge of my napkin, placing my hands lightly in my lap. Everything appeared exactly as it had before, unchanged, predictable, controlled. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted. Not in them, not yet, but in me. Because now, I was no longer observing without context. I was no longer questioning without answers. I understood the structure. I understood the boundaries. And most importantly, I understood exactly where I stood within it, not as they had defined me, but as it had already been defined long before tonight. I lifted my gaze once more, scanning the room with quiet precision, taking in every detail, every movement, every expression. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself the smallest trace of certainty, not visible, not spoken, but present all the same. They believed this night belonged to them. They believed the story was theirs to tell. But they had forgotten something essential. Stories do not belong to those who speak the loudest. They belong to those who understand them completely. And now, finally, I did. The evening began to stretch toward its final hours, though no one seemed eager to acknowledge it. The music had grown fuller, the dance floor more crowded, the conversations louder and less restrained, as if the entire room was leaning into the illusion of celebration just a little more before it had to end. I remained seated for a moment longer, watching it all with the same quiet attention I had carried throughout the night, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, my posture unchanged. The envelope in my purse no longer felt like a question. It felt like an answer that had simply been waiting for me to recognize it. I rose slowly, smoothing my dress with a familiar, practiced motion, and reached for the glass of water that had been placed beside me earlier. I took a small sip, setting it back down with careful precision before stepping away from the table once again. This time, I did not move toward the edges of the room. I walked toward the center, toward the space where Daniel and Rebecca stood, still surrounded by guests, still holding their place at the heart of the evening, as if nothing could shift it. A few people noticed my approach, their conversations pausing just slightly, their eyes following me with quiet curiosity. I offered no explanation, no signal of intent, only the same calm expression that had become my steady companion throughout the night. When I reached them, I stopped at a respectful distance, waiting just long enough for their attention to turn toward me naturally, without interruption. Rebecca was the first to notice, her smile remaining in place as she turned, though something in her eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second, something that suggested she had not expected this. "Margaret," she said, her tone warm, practiced, as though this were any other moment, any other interaction. Daniel followed her gaze, his expression shifting slightly, not into discomfort, but into something more cautious, more measured. "Mom," he added, his voice steady. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging them both. "It is a beautiful evening," I said, my voice calm, even, carrying just enough to be heard without drawing attention beyond our immediate circle. Rebecca's smile brightened, relief settling into her posture as she nodded. "We are so glad you think so," she replied. "It means a lot." I let a small pause settle between us, not long enough to create tension, but long enough to be noticed. "It should," I said softly. It was thoughtfully arranged. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his gaze steady on mine, searching perhaps for something more, something he could interpret, something that would confirm the version of this moment he expected. I did not give it to him. Instead, I reached up, adjusting the small card pinned to my dress, ensuring it was perfectly aligned, perfectly visible. Rebecca's eyes followed the movement, just briefly, and for the first time that evening, Her smile faltered, not disappearing, but tightening in a way that suggested awareness, however faint. "I will not keep you," I continued, my tone unchanged, my expression composed. "There is still much of the evening left to enjoy." Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if unsure whether to respond or simply accept what had been said. "Of course," he replied. "We appreciate you being here." I met his gaze for a moment longer, allowing the silence to settle into something more defined, something that carried meaning without needing to be spoken. Then I gave a small nod, turned, and stepped away before either of them could say anything further. I did not look back. I did not need to. The room continued around me, unchanged on the surface, the music rising, the laughter returning, the movement uninterrupted. But I could feel it now, subtle but present, a shift in the air, a slight adjustment in the way people looked at me as I passed, as though something had altered, something they could not yet name but could no longer ignore. I returned to my table briefly, retrieving my purse, ensuring that everything was exactly where it needed to be. Then, without hesitation, I made my way toward the exit. No announcement, no farewell, just a quiet departure, as deliberate as every other choice I had made that evening. At the entrance, the same young woman who had handed me my name tag earlier glanced up, her expression polite, unaware of anything beyond her role. I offered her a small, genuine smile as I passed. Something simple, something unburdened. "Have a good evening," she said softly. "You as well," I replied. Outside, the air was cool, the night calm, the sounds of the celebration fading behind me as the doors closed. I paused for a moment, allowing the quiet to settle, to replace